Episode 76, Leo the Great Revisited. Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. We are on Facebook and Twitter. This is the first episode of the year 2019. If you are listening to this episode in the far distant future, that won't mean very much. But before we get started, I'd like to do some 2019 housekeeping very quickly. Firstly, I'd like to send my appreciation out to two donators. Firstly, Craig, who signed up on Patreon at the Alexandria level. I'll have a bit more to say about Patreon in just a moment. I would also like to thank Daniel for sending me the Cambridge History of Christianity Volume 5, The Church in the East, from the History of the Papacy Amazon wish list. I didn't even think that book was on the wish list. Maybe Daniel read my mind that I would love that book. But anyways, whether it was on the list or not, thank you so much, Daniel. I'm really going to enjoy that one. Before we move on, I want to announce that I am no longer going to take donations through Patreon. There's really a bunch of reasons for this decision. The current dust-up sort of thing was the icing on the cake. For one thing, I've started to think running ads and asking for Patreon support and all of that has just become too much. So in the end, the short story is that leaving Patreon has been a decision a long time in the coming. I am so very appreciative to all the people on the History of the Papacy diptychs. If you really, really, really want to donate to the show, the History of the Papacy Amazon wish list is a great way. I also have a link on the website a2zhistorypage.com with a PayPal donation button. I may start up some sort of donation system again through another company, but I don't have any plans at the moment. It would really have to be the right thing at the right time that offered the right sort of benefits, and there would just have to be a lot of features that would need to be to go a certain way. I'm thinking of some other options as well. But really, in the end, there was a lot of reasons, and like I said, this was a long time in coming, and I want to thank everybody who did donate and who will donate in different ways, and just the people who are listening. That's the thing that really makes me happy, and that's the thing that I appreciate the most, is that you guys are out there listening, and that will be a big part of 2019, as hopefully there will be a lot to listen to. Now, I'd like to, at this point, give a shout out to the Agora Podcast Network of Podcaster of the Month, Dominic Perry's History of Egypt podcast. It's a great, thought-provoking show that he really tackles a really fascinating aspect of history, so I really highly encourage you to listen. You can learn more by following the links in the show notes, or go to agorapodcastnetwork.com. Okay, with all of that out of the way, today we are going to have another great collaboration with Jonathan from the History of the Copts podcast. Today we talk about Pope Leo the Great, but from a slightly different perspective. This is what I really love about the medium of podcasting. It isn't a book that has to be organized and completed in a certain way. Once you're done with a certain topic in a book, there's really no way of going back. We don't have that limitation here. We can move in and out of eras when there's new information or new perspectives. Here we have a new perspective on Leo the Great. The Coptic and Oriental Orthodox have a very different view on Leo than the Western Church does. He is no great hero or saint. In today's episode, Jonathan and I will look at why some consider Leo great and others view him as the ultimate bad guy coming out of that Council of Chalcedon we talk so much about. If you enjoy these collaborations, let us know, because there are many more topics we can talk about. Now, for the History of the Papacy supporter diptychs, a huge shout-out goes to our Rome-level patron, Peter the Great. I want to thank our Constantinople-level patrons, Sandy, Andy, Paul, Robert, Sean, Yoren, Dr. Jeff, Mary Carmen, Dapo, Brian, Stephen, and Rick, as well as our Alexandria-level supporters Francine, Richard, Justin, Rupert, Roberto, Fiatjoff, Elizabeth, and Craig. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I look forward to seeing you on our next step on our trip through the history of the Popes of Rome and Christian Church.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the second collaboration between the History of the Papacy and the History of the Copts podcasts. I encourage you to check out our first collaboration to find out more about our podcasts and some background information on the historical people and events that we are covering. Today, we are going to touch on a topic that is a bit controversial, but should be fascinating. You see, when I was doing the episodes on Chalcedon, it was incredibly fun, but it was missing something. And no matter how much I tried, there was just no way I could give Pope Leo the Great his due without getting too sidetracked from the events happening in Alexandria. This is why we felt that this collaboration is really needed. Steve, for someone who knows very little about the development of the Roman papacy, can you give us a brief overview of the political, cultural, and ecclesiastical world of Leo the Great?
Well, the Western Roman Empire at this point, you're talking the mid-400s. This is the slow decline that's reaching sort of the fast decline. The barbarians, if you were well past the gate by the mid-400s. Leo was Pope of Rome from 440 to 461 AD or CE, whichever you prefer. And just to put that into bigger perspective, the Roman army completely left Britain in 410. The Roman Empire in the West's official end date is traditionally set in 476. So that date's only 15 years after Leo's death. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Alans, Huns, Anglo-Saxons, and Franks were moving into the Western Roman Empire, and they were really there to stay. They were fundamentally changing Western Europe and beginning to shape what Western Europe was to become. A unified Roman Empire turned into a patch quilt of warring parties, warring states, and little kingdoms, in the West at least. Now, on the ecclesiastical side, the popes of Rome were solidifying their power. In places like Gaul and North Africa, these bishops were trying to exert some of their own power and maybe become almost like patriarchs in their own right. But the popes were constantly fighting back to have their patriarchal power over the entirety of Western Europe, or what you might also call Latin, the Latin Empire, the Latin sphere. The Bishopric of Rome was very conservative theologically and were often considered a bulwark of orthodoxy, which we'll get into a little bit later, whether that's completely accurate or maybe something that was used by other sees as in their power plays. But this considering that they were the most orthodox or very orthodox and very conservative, there was a few reasons for this. The Latin Church was more unified. They spoke a common tongue, Latin, and they were generally culturally more unified than the eastern side of the Roman Empire. Plus the Latin Roman culture, these are things that are going back hundreds of years in the past. Latin and Roman culture was much less inclined towards philosophy and pushing theological frontiers. They were maybe more practical, you might say. Pope Leo really made a big deal that Rome was the patrimony of the Apostle Peter and Paul, and Leo is the first pope to use the title of Pontifex Maximus, or High Priest of Christianity. So he's trying to tie himself into this crumbling Roman Empire and joining in the church, so kind of syncretizing those two forces together.
Yeah, I think I almost had a line in my podcast. It was like, the weaker that the civil government in the West got, the more the popes felt it necessary to exert their ecclesiastical power, because that's very much was the only thing that keeping the West together. And if it wasn't for it, then like you said, all the bishops in France and Britain and all Western Europe would have essentially made their own independent churches, and they probably would have varied theologically from the mainstream Christian thought at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there was sort of a push and a pull there, and with the barbarians or the Germanic groups, if you will, taking over, the bishops were really the last man standing, who were representing the vast majority of the people who still felt themselves as Roman. And these bishops were, especially in the big cities, they were the only ones keeping the lights on, so to speak. They were the ones running the civil affairs for the common people, the Roman strata of society. In some places, there was groups called the magnates, who were aristocratic Roman families, but they oftentimes tied in with the Germanic overlords. So the only people who were really representing what you might call the people anymore were the bishops in the West. And there's a lot of fascinating evolution of where that went to, where they had adopted some civil powers, but they were still tied into this greater ecclesiastical power. But that's a different story for a different day.
Yeah. I mean, like the different bases that the East and West took in this period is really fascinating. So, before he became a pope, obviously Pope Leo was very involved in theological discussions and writing, theological works that is still held in high standard to this day. What would his theological training and life was before becoming a pope? Would you say that he went through the average career path of a typical bishop?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. There's really not much is known about his childhood or his education per se. The Liber Pontificalis, the books of the popes, which is a kind of primary source of the day, says Rome was his patria or home country. His writing style suggests he had a solid education, but interestingly, he did not speak or write Greek that we know of. And not knowing Greek would mean his education wasn't as complete as it might have been. He also may have been educated more so as a lawyer or a bureaucrat, in which Greek wouldn't have been quite as important. And we'll see that with that this is kind of the decline of what you might call classical education, where about a century and a half later, Pope Gregory the Great, the only other pope who's called the Great, he had very little Greek knowledge as well. So it could have also been an affectation that Westerners were taking on at this point, that they don't need to need Greek. But there's just a lot of speculation, because we don't know firsthand why people like Leo didn't know Greek. We do know that Leo had a lot of sway in the Latin Church before he even became pope. Leo had St. John Cassian, the person who they call the grandfather of Western monasticism, write a treatise against Nestorius, and Cassian dedicated it to Leo. St. Cyril of Alexandria, who the History of the Copts listeners will know well, he wrote a letter to Leo during the Council of Ephesus about some of the political events and tried to get Leo's help in the situation of a certain Bishop Juvenal over some sort of territorial dispute. And this was all while Leo was still Archdeacon of Rome. That's part of the typical career path for popes and generally bishops, that they would be some sort of high-ranking deacon and sort of slide into the top bishop slot when it opened up. That Archdeacon of Rome was usually the number 2 man of the Pope. Leo was definitely a mover and a shaker well before he became Pope.
Yeah, it's interesting about his relationship with St. John Cassian, who spent some time in Egypt, actually, and he kind of like got the whole monastic system out of there and I believe he went to Gaul. And the other thing that's fascinating is that, as you well aware, all the council minutes and all the works of his fellow bishops in the East were all in Greek. I know when Pope Cyril of Alexandria was writing, he would write it in Greek and have it translated in Alexandria into Latin, and he would send both copies to Rome. I do wonder, with all the stuff that we're going to talk about, in the Council of Chalcedon, how much did the language differences, make a difference?
I think the language difference made a huge amount of difference and probably caused a lot of the fault lines, because concepts in Greek didn't always completely translate perfectly into Latin. That's especially true in the earlier development of the Trinity, which obviously were in sort of the later development of the Trinity by this point in the 400s, but in the early 300s, something that they would say in Greek, when it translated into Latin, it almost necessarily caused some confusion because the terms just did not line up exactly the way it was meant in Greek. They're refining these terms really, really tightly, and then they get translated into a different language where they have a slightly different meaning, and the whole thing sort of falls apart.
Yeah.
I also wonder how much of a clear picture was coming from the east to the west. This is a time where trade routes are falling apart. It's just simply not as easy to move around in the 400s as it was in the late 300s, and it was still even getting difficult to move around at that point. A good example of that is St. Augustine, who lived in the 300s. They're not even sure if he knew that the first Council of Constantinople in 381 had happened. And that's the Second Ecumenical Council. And one of the greatest church fathers of the West might not have even known that council happened. That's how much the communication lines had broken down. So even if they wanted to be in perfect communication with each other, not very much information was getting through.
We're going to talk about Timothy the Cat a little bit today, but I think we might talk about him more later on. Like, he was there in Constantinople negotiating, what kind of sort of exile or place he would be. And then they tried to get Pope Leo feedback. But then by the time Pope Leo replied back, he was already the whole thing was already over, and he was exiled all the way to the end of the world, pretty much. Mm-hmm. So communication lines were definitely an issue. I know that there's some groups or sects that we may say that were pretty influential in the West in Rome, but they had very little presence in the East. When Pope Leo became Pope, he was dealing with some of these groups that have no presence in the East. So can you tell us a little bit about them?
The big groups were the Pelagians, the Donatists, and the Arians within Christianity. And then there was a kind of a hybrid Christian group called the Manichaeans. These Pelagians were an important group that really didn't have a major presence in the East. Pelagianism was based on the ideas of a British priest named Pelagius. He had some ideas about predestination and some other theological views that were opposed to the mainstream view of the Latin Church as defined by Augustine of Hippo. Pelagius's views weren't that far out of the mainstream, especially in the East, where he found maybe not quite his home there, but at least some respite. I think he went to Egypt for a little while. He went to Palestine, the Middle East for a bit. And then I think he wound up dying in Constantinople. And he really wasn't harassed there. He was kind of, because his theology, the scope of that's a bit more than what we're talking about today. But in certain ways, it lined up with more of an Eastern way of thinking.
I mean, yeah, definitely the East were more open to speculations and like you said, that the Roman papacy were very conservative. Mm-hmm. Anything that was not exact to the letter find a pushback, as opposed to the East, where it was more like ideas were not immediately suppressed and discussions took place, and some of them died out pretty quick, some of them survived, but yeah. So I'm not very surprised that, when he went to the East, he was able to walk and talk freely.
Yeah, and then another group that were a major force, especially in North Africa, is a group called the Donatists. And they went way back. They went back to the early 300s, and they had a precursor group that went back even a little bit further. And they were really, you could almost call them Puritans of their day. They believed that the popes of Rome and basically the entire mainstream Christian structure was invalid because the mainstream structure, many of them had in persecutions in the distant past, that they had given into the persecution and maybe sacrificed to the Roman gods or in some other way compromised themselves. That was also sort of a ethnic division inside of North Africa between the Romans and the Berbers. Berbers tended to be more Donatist. That's really an interesting facet of African Christianity, because we see a really clear dividing line between Western Africa and Eastern North Africa. And that's something that I found fascinating, because I really didn't know that Western North Africa, what today you might call the Macabre, like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and the western section of Libya, they fell more into the Western sphere, Western Latin sphere. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Egypt had the Copts and a Greek flavoring, if you will. Western North Africa just turned into a real mess, because you have these Donatists who did, in some ways, worked well with the Catholics, mainstream Christians, but in other ways at other times they would just fight brutally with each other. And that sort of helped break down the social fabric of North Africa, which leads us into the next group that was really important in the Western Roman Empire, which was the Arians. They believed that Jesus and the Holy Spirit were somehow subordinate or under God the Father. These were also theological disputes that had come through the Eastern Roman Empire. A certain Eusebius of Nicomedia, who, if you're familiar with your Council of Nicaea in 325, he was a major player there and actually a big person in developing the first version of the Nicene Creed. He held some views that with this subordinationist, and it's hard to kind of nail down what exactly a subordinationist was, because it evolved and it wasn't exactly the same from one group to the next. But one of his major disciples was a Goth named Wulfilas. Wulfilas spread the subordinationist Christianity into the Goths, who had lived just north of Constantinople. Then it just spread like wildfire through the Goths. So these Goths who came to the Western Roman Empire a century or so later were already Christians. They were just this different form of Christianity. In some cases, like in Spain and North Africa, there were some persecutions, but in other parts, there were just too many Catholic Christians, and they had too strong of a organization for there to be heavy-duty persecutions. It was mostly in North Africa, where you already have this fight between the Donatists and the Catholics. Then you throw in the Vandals, and it makes the situation even messier. And then just that third group, the Manichaeans, they were fairly strong in North Africa too, but they also had a following, and really they were a big city group. They were fighting for a lot of the same converts that Christianity was amongst the upper middle class people, educated. That's where the Manichaeans were focusing in on their recruitment. And that was also an area of recruitment for the Christians too, the Catholic mainstream Christians. So it was in its way, it was its own complicated situation, but pretty different than what was going on in the East.
I think my listeners would remember Eusebius of Nicomedia pretty well. He had like a running battle with Athanasius the Great for like 40 plus years. And it's funny that you said Wulfilas. I actually called him on my podcast Little Wolf, because that's his like literal translation of his name. But so yeah, I mean, I think my listeners at least will be familiar with the Arians, who actually, Arius was an Alexandrian priest, we had a lot to talk about that. The interesting group is the Donatists, who, like as you said, they were pretty much the first, I want to say it's the first church that had no problem separating from the rest of the churches. And they went all the way back to probably the Diocletian persecution. But even under Constantine, he published some edicts about them. And I'm surprised to learn that they were still in force under Pope Leo's reign. How did he deal with these guys? I mean, I'm pretty sure he didn't just leave them be. But what was his interactions to deal with?
That was, in a lot of ways, an inside of North Africa, Carthage type of fight. They would have synods against each other. And like I said, in some ways, they were very integrated with the Catholic Church, but they were also separated too. And there was that ethnic component of the Berbers. There was a group of Berbers who were guerrillas of a sort, guerrilla fighters that came about, and they would go in and fight with the Romans, and the Romans would fight with them. I can't think of anything specific that Leo had to do with them. The real smackdown of the Donatists came by Augustine of Hippo. That was where they really, that the Catholic mainstream position was laid out against them. So it was just a real slow boil between the Catholics and the Donatists at that time. I want to say that Leo did have some decrees against them, and there was something of a council. I just can't think of that offhand.
So I think we covered his background ecclesiastically pretty well. Now, from my understanding, in the times of Pope Leo, the Pope had actual, real, very big deal civil power. So can you tell us a little bit about his relationship with the Western Emperor? Especially that, I read about a famous decree that very much gave him unchecked authority to publish laws and edicts.
The Roman emperors at this time in the West were just very weak. There was Valentinian and his sister Galla Placidia, and they fought for power. And then there would be a teenage emperor, and they were a weakling. And the secular authority it went into decline, and as I said, the bishops were the only connection to that old Roman authority, and they were able to garner resources and organize some semblance of order. The popes had a very strong organization that they had set up in Rome, the city of Rome, and the surrounding countryside. So their office was a natural locus of power. Emperor Valentinian III, he even made use of Leo to solve disputes amongst his general. There was a famous one with the famous general Aetius, who was fighting Attila the Hun. So the church in Rome had money and actual power. The Roman church was becoming powerful and rich independently of the secular Roman apparatus, which was just shrinking in day by day. So you can see why this institution that had connections to the broader world and was very well established within its own countryside would be powerful in the secular realm as well.
The church was replacing the civil authorities bit by bit, and when the barbarian came, it was almost like the civil government was already in decline, so they didn't have big shoes to fill, so to speak. I want to get to the controversy, why we did this collaboration. How did Pope Leo see himself in relation to the other bishops of the empire?
Leo saw himself as at the least as primus inter pares, or equal, first among equal of all the bishops. And that was a view that was generally accepted throughout Christendom at that time, in the East and the West, that the Pope of Rome and the See of Rome was in some way a little bit higher in the ranks than the other traditional sees especially of Antioch and Alexandria. The Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome were called the Petrine sees, or the episcopacies that were founded by Peter all the way back in the earliest days of Christianity. and the Pope of Rome had a reputation of conservatism, of holding to orthodoxy. That made the Pope a go-to for arbitration and as the final word or court of last appeal. And then all of this is at least in theory. These powers weren't exactly written in any canon from a council, but they were powers that had developed and evolved over the previous century or so. The traditional, as I said, the big three Petrine patriarchies of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch were confirmed in Canon 6 of the Council of Nicaea in 325. Then we also get into an issue of the Council of Chalcedon, which is the big issue of today, is the 28th canon that came out of the Council of Chalcedon in 451. That canon raised the see of Constantinople to just slightly below that of Rome. Leo was not happy about this canon whatsoever and actually almost scuttled the entire Council of Chalcedon over this one canon. So think about that. The whole Council of Chalcedon, the cause of the first great schism of Christianity, and arguably a greater schism than 1054 or even the Protestant Reformation, almost went down in flames over just one canon. Leo eventually line item vetoed this canon, and the council was accepted. Then later popes did accept the 28th canon. I think the Eastern bishops respected the See of Rome as the apostolic see in the court of last appeal, but with definitely asterisks after that. They appealed to Rome when they thought that it was to their advantage, to the politics in the East. What did Alexandria think about Canon 28 of Chalcedon at that point, or they just didn't care?
Well, I think the view that the BBC was a court of a last appeal, so to speak, that was seriously challenged in Alexandria since day one. Like you said, Alexandria, I mean, especially when you talk about the more politically astute bishops of Alexandria, had no problem enlisting the help and the support of Rome when there were, have problems with Antioch or Constantinople. Deep down, like I think there was an instance when Pope Dioscorus got elevated, he sent a letter to Pope Leo saying, hey, by the way, I'm the new Bishop of Alexandria, sort of an introduction. And then Pope Leo responded by some doctrinal advice saying like, hey, feel free to celebrate liturgy twice a day if you need to. And the reaction of Alexandria was like, why are you sending us this advice? I mean, thank you, but, we will figure it out by ourselves. So I feel like the whole first among equals or court of last appeal, that really came after Leo the Great. Like, as we will get to it, that was his big thing. He was saying that, I'm the representative of St. Peter and Rome has the eternal city. But the bishops in the East, for the most part, they felt that the way to determine issues, so to speak, was church councils. And within those church councils, there was lots of politics, as you probably would know. And then that's when you enlist whoever can gather the biggest coalition would probably carry the day. But as far as Canon 28, Alexandria have always stuck with the line that Chalcedon, and it's entirely a mistake. So in the specific issue of Canon 28, they didn't really raise much issue about that because the whole council was a mistake. Canon 28 actually worked in the favor of Constantinople and like between all the back and forth between the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonians. Canon 28 saved Chalcedon time and time again. Because even when they would say, okay, fine, we can change the theology of it a little bit, then it comes back, well, Constantinople would lose its position, so to speak, from Canon 28. And then that becomes an issue and be like, we cannot touch the Council of Chalcedon. And it wasn't just Canon 28. I don't know if it's Canon 28 or another canon. It also elevated the Jerusalem see into a patriarchy. So the two strongholds of Chalcedon in the east were Constantinople and Jerusalem, the two sees that got their position elevated from the Council of Chalcedon, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's also important to look at the bigger picture of the Roman Empire and Christianity at this point, because it'll shed a better light on why the Council of Chalcedon was so contentious. I like to divide the Roman Empire into 4 quarters for the purpose of Christianity. And there's, those divisions don't exactly mirror the division of the empire politically, but there was some overlap. Each portion of the empire had a unique religious and secular political situation. In the West, we know that Latin Christianity was by far the majority, but like we said, there was all these other groups like the Manichaeans and the Pelagians and the Donatists. Then the issue of the Arians that was coming into play, and that's where the bishops and the popes of Rome started to see themselves as sort of the moderator between the excesses, what they felt as the excesses of the Monophysite Miaphysites on one side and the Nestorians on the other. Then you have Constantinople, and this is the real Roman Empire at this point in history. They had some close calls with collapse, but they were coming out of this time period fairly strong politically and militarily. Religiously, the emperor felt that the Bishop of Constantinople should be much more powerful than they were, and that's a political thing that we'll see throughout all of Christianity. Like a place like Jerusalem had a lot of religious importance because that's where the events of Jesus happened. But as a part of like a city, economically, it wasn't anything. Militarily, it wasn't anything. You have Alexandria that was really powerful economically, militarily. Had trade connections. And then Constantinople, that was important politically, but the Bishop of Constantinople really wasn't that powerful religiously at this point. Then you have Rome that feels itself very important religiously, but the political and the economically, it's on the decline. So you see where the emperor wants a really powerful bishop in his capital. A powerful emperor needs a powerful bishop. And each one of those, Constantinople at this point didn't have a super strong, and they always didn't have a super strong theological position. The emperor was really the dominant factor there, and he wanted a theological position that would make everyone happy, which in most situations didn't make anyone happy. Then you have the one last one that's important for Chalcedon as we throw the Middle East in there. And the Middle East was really a grab bag. There were Monophysites there, Nestorians, and just about every other Christian belief system you could imagine, and non-Christian. By the time of the Third Ecumenical Council of Ephesus, the Nestorians were pretty much out of the picture. They made their way out of the Roman Empire and made their way into the Persian Empire. And that's where they got established and would flourish for centuries to come.
What would you say was Pope Leo's attitude toward, by this point, very common Eastern Church councils? Specifically, the controversial Council of Ephesus II, or as he called it, the Robber Council. There was lots of back and forth theological arguments between, I want to say, generally speaking, the Church of Antioch and the Church of Alexandria. How much did you really know this intricate back and forth, and Theodore teaching Nestorius, and Nestorius making this whole argument, and then Cyril responded back, and the 12 anathemas of Cyril? How much you really know out of all this background that was going on?
One gap that I have in my knowledge is, do the Coptic Church, do they see the Second Council of Ephesus as ecumenical or somehow in the same importance as the first 3 councils?
So traditionally, yes, it was these 4 councils. But about maybe, I want to say like 50 years ago, there was a series of theological discussions back and forth, and, everybody's trying to work toward unity. And then it would be very hard to, accept Ephesus II as a ecumenical council and then work towards unity, because, Ephesus II is very controversial. No, I would say the best thing right now is no one really likes to talk about it. If, these efforts towards unity came to be, I don't think they would have any problems dropping Ephesus II from the list of, religiously sanctified ecumenical councils. But if things didn't work out, then Ephesus too would stay in its high important status.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, in the West, this Ephesus II council was called the Latrocinium, or like you said, the Robbers' Council or the Council of Thieves. And this was a term that was actually coined by Leo himself. The Second Council of Ephesus was a real mess and helped to further build the feelings of distrust between the East and the West. It was always difficult for Western bishops to attend these big councils in the East. I believe that the Council of Nicaea in 325 only had a small handful of Western bishops, and the Council of Constantinople in 381 either had another very small amount or even none. And the so-called Robber Council had no Western bishops in actual attendance, with the exception of the papal legate, Hilarius, and Hilarius or Hilary wasn't even allowed to speak. And in the end, he was chased out of town. He had to sneak out of Ephesus on a horse, and they had to hide in stables. One small point about these councils, these early councils, the really big councils, these ecumenical councils, the emperor was represented, and a pope never actually attended one of the great councils, but he always had a legate or a official representative of himself at these councils. But they were almost always very sparsely attended by the West. Some of them would have attendees from the Balkans that was technically under the Pope's control at that time. So they were really the only Western bishops to attend these councils. Like sometimes like an oddball bishop from like Britain would show up, but that was very rare. And I mean, and you look at it in the whole scope of things, when there's a couple of hundred bishops attending a council, you can pretty much guarantee the biggest concentration of bishops that are going to go to that council are the ones who live within a reasonable distance of the city where it's being held, just because of the transportation issue. The Second Council of Ephesus in 449, that loaded term of Robber Council, was orchestrated by Dioscorus to certain ends, and there was really no way for the Pope in Rome was going to get assent in that council. And what I've called in my podcast the Imperial Roman School, which sort of is outside of like what you said, the real issues, theological issues, were set by Antioch and the Alexandrian school. The Constantinople Rome Imperial Theological School was something of a hybrid between the two. The Roman emperors in Constantinople wanted unity, and that was basically their program since Constantine back in the early 300s. And we'll see that the goal of Constantinople and the emperors in Constantinople was to just try and find unity to make everyone happy and get along well. Alexandria, the Middle East, Asia Minor, a little bit of the Balkans. And if it made the West happy too, that's great. The Roman Church really hardened their positions because they were in conflict with these Arians. And that's maybe a stark difference between the situation between the East and the West. In a lot of ways, the West was really fundamentally falling apart. They were fighting for their lives at this point, and they were backed in the corner. So, and when somebody's in that situation, they're just in a lot less of a position to compromise. And then another issue is that just the Latin Church, from going back to almost the beginning, they just didn't have time for all that fancy philosophizing, if you will, of the East. And all that just reinforced the Latin, even just bigger than just Latin Christianity, the Latin Western idea that the Greek East was backstabbers and politicians and just not practical straight shooters like the Latins. And these were just all cultural conceptions between the Greek East and the Latin West that went back hundreds of years at this point and really carried through to the Middle Ages. There was just always a level of mistrust between the two worldviews. Eastern philosophy and theology often lost something in translation when it came over to the West, like we were saying, as well as the Latin Church often simplified or made Eastern theological arguments more concise, if you will. And arguing these fine philosophical or theological points just wasn't something that the Latin Church did. The nature of the Trinity wasn't in contention, especially when they're looking at it. Their view of the Trinity was so different than the Arians. And you also have to remember that the very idea of the Trinity was at least starting to be formulated by Tertullian, a Latin father. So the Latin Church didn't feel like they had to defend their theological positions because they felt they owned them.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, and this is what I felt too when I went through this material, is that the East keep talking about the theological finer points, and then the Church in Rome is saying we're the last word on it. So, and this is for practical purposes. And it became this, like, one person is, like you said, talking about philosophy and very intricate definitions and specific words and, what does hypostasis and persona and nature, all these words mean. And another side is saying, look, this is not really what we're trying to do here. We have a church and an empire to run. If we keep going back and forth, this really compromises the position of the Pope in Rome. The political instability of the West kept leading to a more assertive papacy. And this, in a way, it just made the theological positions very hardened, the theological positions. And it became more a way to assert the primacy of the Roman See. When I went through this material, I felt like there was almost this interactions between Christianity and the state that was just trying to find its way, especially in the West. Would you elaborate a little bit on this, Steve?
I think you have to look at Christianity, that Christianity, unlike really most other religions, especially the monotheistic religions, never had a governing philosophy. Like Judaism had a governing philosophy and laws for that. And Islam is really a governing ideal with the religious ideal. And Christianity, even from the beginning, and it's even in the Gospels, that it gives the secular authorities their authorities. And even if they don't agree with the secular authority, they have to somehow have a connection to the civil government. And you see in Constantinople that the church had a natural connection with the civil government. There was an emperor and there was a bishop, the Bishop of Constantinople, which would later be called the ecumenical bishop, or ecumenical patriarch rather, and that ecumenical part really tied it into the government of the Eastern Roman Empire. And even in Alexandria, and it's funny, the popes of Alexandria, which you'll talk and you have talked about it, you'll see that the Roman popes also developed this later. They kind of wore two hats, a government hat and a religious hat. And those two hats were never the same hat. They'd have to, take one off to do civil things and put the other one on to do religious things. And that's what the popes of Rome developed into. But it took a long time to do that. And they went from one empire to the next, the Roman Empire to the Ostrogothic Empire, the Lombards a little bit, back to the Byzantines. And it would just take a long time. And if you look at it, this is really where the idea of separation of church and state comes in to the Western European ideal, is that the Pope was never a theocracy in the traditional sense, that power, even if it was inside of the one person of the Pope, was always separated. And I think that says a lot for why the popes of Rome, that is, act in certain ways, is that they always had this weird relationship between secular civil authority and ecclesiastical authority.
Yeah, I mean, in my podcast right now, I'm going through the braid of Justinian and the whole 3 chapters controversy, and you can see that weird relationship between Emperor and Pope really comes into the picture, and it's really fascinating. But like, you see the seeds of it is being sown right now. The Roman Empire is being weakened. Invaders like the Huns, who I'm going to talk about in a bit, are coming in, and the Roman papacy is trying to find its way in all this changing civil government. And at the same time, they're trying to put a distance between ecclesiastical affairs and civil government, and what comes out is the Western ideal. Eventually, after 1,000 years of back and forth, comes the Western ideal of separation between church and state. A concept, like, that in the East, it was almost crazy to even think about. Like, if the emperor decided to call a council, then no one would say, oh, why are you calling a council? It would be like, oh, that's his job. He will call a council, and then we come and we discuss theological issues. But before I lose my point about the changing of the civil governments and the whole instability, one factor that almost no one talks about when they talk about the Council of Chalcedon and the events surrounding it is the Huns. The Huns, where the Council of Chalcedon was going on, they were threatening both the East and the West. And the Council of Chalcedon got moved because no one knew if they would be able to have it, because the Huns were on the doors, so to speak. So can you speak a little bit about, the fears of the Roman papacy and how the interactions between the West and the Huns played out in this period?
What I was thinking too is tying into your last point, the phase 2 of this collaboration would definitely be the events of the 5th council in the mid-500s with Justinian and Vigilius and the Henoticon and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I would like to do it. The whole point of the Copts, like, the casual feeling, and I'm sure this is probably the picture that you got out of it, is that the whole 3-chapter thing was about a compromise with the Miaphysites. Mm-hmm. But when you really dig deep into it, because I'm digging deep into it, it has nothing to do with the Miaphysites. This was all a factional fight between the Origenist Palestinian monks and more of the Babel influences in Constantinople. And Justinian was just coming out of it sort of a confused man out of the plague and all the disasters that were happening, and the war in Italy that wasn't going so well. And one of those Palestinian monks kind of took him on the side and be like, hey, if you excommunicate this guy who is bad-mouthing Origen, then you might bring the Miaphysites back. And that's how the whole thing started. But the Miaphysites at this point, they were just doing their own thing. They were completely outside of the government, especially after Theodora, his wife, died. The link was completely cut. So Justinian was jumping all through these hoops to trying to bring them back, but they weren't even no one even asked them, hey, would you guys be okay if we have this? We can do it, but I'm probably not going to have anything to say about the Copts because they were just doing their own thing at this point.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Back to the Huns and Attila. Yeah. The Huns were really like a black cloud that hung over really the entirety of the old world, European world, Asian world at this point. Attila the Hun, of course, was important to Western European history, but in the big scheme of things, the Huns were really a flash in the pan. And I think that his name says a ton about who the real motive power were behind the Huns. The name Attila itself, that wasn't his actual name. That was his nickname, which comes from a Gothic Germanic word meaning little father. Atta was father, and Ila or Illa was the diminutive that made it little father. his army and the leadership was really largely made of these Germanic Goths. The Goths were the ones to keep your eye on in Western Europe and North Africa. They dominated the next 150 years of history from this point forward, even more so if you count the Lombards who joined the party a little bit later. The Huns really lost most of their control after the death of Attila. Interesting, the Vandals, they sacked Rome in 455, which was just a very few short years after the Council of Chalcedon. And we think of things in our time that if there was a council in Chalcedon today, that CNN would be there and we'd know every happenings of it. The news, even in 455, was still kind of filtering its way back into Rome a couple of years later. And the communication situation we can't harp on that enough, that it went from just difficult to worse as the 400s went along. There's just so many different factors why this Council of Chalcedon was so important and contentious.
Yeah, my take on it was you had the change in leadership in the emperor, in the emperors between Theodosius II and Marcian. And when Marcian came into power, Theodosius was paying tribute to the Huns, or just giving them subsidies to stay away, and it wasn't really working. And when Marcian came, he had this whole change of policy of no, we got to confront the Huns. And to do that, he was Rome, even so it's weakened at this point, is very important, because I cannot be the only person who's fighting the Huns. I need the resources of the West too. And that all of a sudden, Theodosius was kind of okay, the West wasn't really big on his mind. But Marcian was no, we got to get the West in here to fight the Huns, which completely brought that whole let's have unity within the West and the East became much, much more important. And my take on it was the Huns strengthening both the East and the West was a big factor in that. So to move a little bit from the political situation to the theological situation, if you will. In so many of the ancient primary sources, especially the ones that are coming from the West, Dioscorus gets painted, and his theology gets painted in a really simplified, really ridiculous, Christ is only divine argument. And from the primary sources in the East, Leo gets vilified as well. Leo's arguments gets vilified as well as being just crypto-Nestorian argument. What I really wanted to know, did Pope Leo really know, did he really buy the bulimic coming against Dioscorus? Did he really think Dioscorus was only saying Christ is fully divine and there is no humanity in there? And can you elaborate a little bit about what Pope Leo was saying in theological terms?
I think you got right to the point that everybody was really oversimplifying the other people's arguments in a way that was they were fighting the extremes of both sides. So the Copt side of it, or the Miaphysite side of it, their opponents were using Eutychius, who had a pretty one nature theology, he was definitely the outlier. He became the poster boy for their theology. Nestorius, who his theology was, he became the poster boy for the Antiochene theology, even though it's hard to, Nestorius was not what you might call
a Nestorian. And Nestorius was not what would you call as a traditional Nestorian.
Yeah, he was not a strong theologian.
Yeah, and he was also pissed off the wrong people, and so there's lots of things going on with Nestorius. And by the way, the same goes for Eutychius. He also was just this monk that was involved in palace intrigue with a eunuch named Chrysippus, and they had lots of influence on Theodosius. But then there was another faction, the Patriarch of Constantinople was involved, and they were trying to undermine the other faction. So they got him one time and one thing he said, but then he went back on it. So if you really dig deep enough, Nestorius wasn't we really simplify what Nestorius is saying, and we really do simplify what Eutychius is saying. both of them have said some questionable things at some point of their career. But when they were backed into a corner, both of them were happy to walk back whatever they said that was a problem. But, I think you're right that Nestorius's views are too simplified as well.
All of the sides on this, really, they were arguing against the straw man of Nestorius, who, if you read the sources, he put his foot in his mouth a lot. Eutyches, he said a lot of things, and he was more of a political player than a theological thinker. They become more of the poster boys for this fight. They also, the Chalcedonians try to say like that the Miaphysites were just the same as Apollinaris of Laodicea's theology, which, as far as I know, the Miaphysites completely rejected.
By the way, for the listeners who do not know who Apollinaris is, this guy, he was essentially a guy who expressed his theology in terms where the divine took the soul of the human Christ. So there was a mixing between the nature, so to speak. But the Miaphysite church, of course, rejects that. But the reason why that came was that some of his writing, his followers, they changed his writing and attributed them to Athanasius. So, of course, we'd be like, oh, look, this is what Athanasius have said. But Athanasius have really never said that. Or Cyril never really have said that. They faked some of his writing and attributed them to Athanasius and Cyril. And then eventually, by the time of Severus of Antioch, this thing was figured out. The Miaphysite church pulled away from these writings, especially after Severus.
And talking about Leo, his theology, it's really laid out completely in a book called The Tome of Leo, which was a document that Leo, he originally submitted it to that Second Council of Ephesus, and it wasn't even allowed to be read there, but it was the basic foundation of the Council of Chalcedon. I should preface at this point that I'm not an academic historian or a theology or anything of that sort, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But for me, reading Leo's tome, you can get it pretty easily anywhere online. It prints out to about 3 or 4 pages of regular paper. It's very easy to read. And from what I understand, it's Latin is very easy to read. So if you know Latin, it's a very readable document. And it lays out, it tries to thread the needle between a pure one nature and a pure two nature Christology. And what happened was in the Council of Chalcedon and later is Leo's tome is the basis and sprinkled with Cyrillian theology to really get what we have in modern Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodoxy Christology. They're really a mixture of Cyrillian and Tome of Leo theology. What really develops out of this is that these Jesus wars that go on during the 400s and the 500s is a lot of splits happened because they had a lot of reason to not get along with each other. But we see now that a lot of the churches are they have a lot more reasons to get along with each other now. Where you have really high-level conversations between the Eastern and the Oriental Orthodox, which the Copts are a member of having closer relations. And the Roman Catholics have they have like 3 or 4 documents of common theological and Christological agreement where they're not quite in communion with each other, but they've said like, hey, this was kind of just a little dust up we had 1,500 years ago. Things really weren't as bad as what we thought they were. And this is all stuff that's happened within the last 50 years or so. So I think you'll see that a lot of things are going to change because we're in a time period now where there's a lot less reason to quibble over these fine points than there was in the 400s.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The more we dig into these things, the more we find like there was lots of mixing between palace and church, and that has some consequences to it. And one of these consequences is you get all these power plays being expressed in finer theological points, But the theology was probably the secondary issue here, not being the primary issue. And hopefully, as you said, was moving forward, these conversations can lead to stuff that's practical. And you're right, in a way, they are already leading to some practical unity talks. I feel like what comes next of Leo's career is sort of neglected. He writes the Tomb of Leo. That becomes the basis of the Council of Chalcedon, and then that's it. But really, after the Council of Chalcedon, there was a battle raging on in the East between pro and anti-Chalcedon camps, and he was a big part of it. He was a little bit delayed because of all the communication problems, but his relationship with Marcion and Bulgaria, who was very influential at this point as well, was very important, and he was still part of the conversation. So did he ever modify his position a bit as more information came in? Did he really get a picture of Alexandria being in complete revolt once that Dioscorus gets exiled and gets replaced by someone else?
I think that at this point, well, we do see a lot of that Leo's really, he's just adding fuel to the fire to what's going on in Alexandria. A big part of his post-Chalcedonian biography is trying to get Dioscorus, or more so Timothy the Cat, removed as the bishop, and getting Chalcedonian bishops, not even just in Alexandria, but throughout East, putting in his 2 cents to try and get Chalcedonian bishops put in where there was non-Chalcedonian bishops. Probably most of the news that they would have gotten would have been more gossip than official news from the East through traders and that sort of thing. There's tons of letters that go back and forth by that point, except like really high level letters.
Yeah, like you said, in the casual telling of the story, his relationship with Dioscorus gets lots of time. But the really fascinating stuff was his relationship with Dioscorus' successor in Alexandria, Timothy the Cat, whom he called in one letter the Antichrist. And then the Chalcedonian bishop of Alexandria, Virtutes, even so he was a Chalcedonian and initially, supported by Leo, he got in a serious fight with Leo about the Easter date. The fight about the Easter date really makes me wonder how much of all this conflict was really about theology versus, the primacy of one see over another, or, who gets to decide the Easter date, or even the personalities involved, whether it was Leo, Dioscorus, Timothy, or Virtutes.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting part of the equation. Not only were they fighting over the nature of Christology, it's like adding gasoline to the fire when you start talking about the Easter date. That's probably only the second biggest fight that happens in early Christianity. It's Christology, and then it's the dating of Easter. Eventually, Leo even does give in to that Alexandrine dating of Easter, because that was even a canon of the Council of Nicaea in 325, is that Alexandria sets the date of Easter.
Yeah, Virtutes surprisingly won this fight. It's probably the only fight that Leo have lost.
Yeah, I think once you get into a fight about Easter, that's when it becomes just a battle royale. And that's really what happens afterwards, is that it just gets nasty with Timothy the Cat, who they also, I don't know if it's just an alternative translation of the Greek that it's the cat or the weasel, and weasel apparently had the same connotation as it does in English, as somebody who's like untrustworthy. But it was just a nasty fight by that point.
It's funny, actually. You can tell what kind of a secondary source a book would be by their translation of Timothy's name. If it's Timothy the Cat, then it would be from like a Miaphysite or Eastern point of view. If it's Timothy the Weasel, then you can be pretty sure of it's going to be from a Western point of view. But like the name, like the Greek translation can be both of them. And even the explanation behind the name, so he's either the cat because he was a monk and he was ascetic and he was skinny and he looked like a cat, or, he's a weasel because he was sneaking into Alexandria when he shouldn't and being like, shady. So Timothy the Cat is probably one of the most fascinating individuals in the history of the Copts, and he is one of my favorites.
Yeah, he's definitely, once you learn about him, even in the broader scope of church history, he's one of the most fascinating characters, especially to come out of this era.
Yeah, I titled his episode "A Hero with a question mark." First, the Chalcedonian bishop in Alexandria, he gets murdered. Probably out of a local struggle with the general in charge of Alexandria, but possibly by the locals who saw him when he replaced Dioscorus as a new Judas, so to speak. They saw that their bishop was Dioscorus, and whoever, when the imperial government imposed the sky on them, then he was betraying Dioscorus. But anyway, this immediately sets a backlash against Timothy. And everybody blames him for the murder, even though he probably had nothing to do with it. And then he goes on, lives like a very interesting life. He gets exiled, then goes to write several brilliant theological treatises. One of them actually is really long, and he essentially gets the Tomb of Leo line by line, and then he refutes it point by point. And then after all this, he comes back as a conquering hero, because there was a small civil war between the Byzantine emperors and a usurper. It was Emperor Zenos escaping Constantinople and then coming back. And then, Timothy travels in the east, goes to Ephesus, gets this great welcome as a hero. And he goes to Alexandria, and then, he's like essentially on top of the world. But then Zeno comes back, and then he's ready to exile him. But then Timothy dies, in Alexandria after this, very interesting life. He gets a bad rep, so to speak, in the whole post-Chalcedonian events. But he pretty much, if it was anybody else but him, the whole Miaphysite movement would have probably, faded into the background. But Timothy the Cat, through his intellectual and theological work, really put the foundations for it. Lastly, this is one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Steve. There's only two popes that are called that great. Leo is one of them. But, we can argue back and forth between it, but he is really a big part of the first major schism of the universal church. So why did he earn that label? And, for the history of the Copts listeners who are not as familiar with Leo, what would be something really cool about him that, had nothing to do with Chalcedon and all this back and forth stuff?
He's considered great because he's the defender of the Western Church and Western concerns in general. He's the one who really kickstarted the project of papal primacy and defending Chalcedonian orthodoxy. This is the difference between the Latin West and the East, and why they would see him as great. This time period of the middle 400s was a really important time. It's the beginning of the separation of the Western and the Eastern churches. The West just didn't really care about carefully weaving a coalition of Eastern theological and political positions. The West didn't have a concern about these Eastern concerns. And that's, I think, why he's the great, because he was such a pivotal theological thinker to the West and a political leader in the West. And that ties into what the fun fact about Leo is his showdown with Attila the Hun. This traditional story is almost certainly highly embellished, but it's still an interesting story. What Leo goes toe-to-toe with Attila the Hun in what's northern Italy, and Attila the Hun backed down and went to the other side of the Alps. Now, this could be because there's the story that Attila looked behind Leo and saw like a ghostly apparition of St. Peter and St. Paul with like flaming swords. But it was more likely that Attila was really at the end of his rope logistically, and things had finally settled down in the East, and the Emperor Marcian was sending an army from behind to hit Attila. But I mean, to the Romans, they would have saw that the Romans, meaning Romans living in Rome, it's kind of hard at this this point to separate those two words. There's Rome, the city of Rome versus the Roman Empire, but the people of like central and southern Italy would have seen it that Leo goes and turns back Attila. That would have definitely have given him the great right there. And Leo was also responsible for taming the Vandal. When the Vandals came and they laid siege to Rome, instead of just plundering the city, he got them to where they would be able to plunder certain sites, and it made it a much more organized plundering than just coming in and killing and raping everyone. So those two things, he protected, or he was seen as a political protector and a theological protector, and that's why he gets the title of the Great.
Pretty fascinating individual. No matter which side you look into it, there's no doubt, like you said, that he really started this project of Papal primacy. And I would say if there's lots of men, if they were in his shoes, the Western Church would have been completely disintegrating by this point, and everybody would just do their own thing. If it wasn't for Leo putting in the Papal primacy stamp on things and getting everybody looking toward Rome as the first of the churches. And this whole Chalcedon thing was just almost like a consequence, or I want to say like a side effect of his concerns in the West. And it could have been, there was many opportunities afterward where it could have been just this was a dust up and everything, went back to normal. But it almost went from one misstep to another misstep, and from one extreme position to another extreme position.
I think, like you said, it's probably that next phase where things could have been smoothed out during the fifth council, the mid 500s with Justinian, if it hadn't been for the really devastating Gothic War in Italy, which basically just destroyed Italy for several hundred years later, where it didn't come back politically and economically. That did not enamor the West to giving into Eastern concerns, where a new governmental situations and set up in the West that just didn't get along with the Byzantines. And then, like you said, where the Copts didn't have a lot of reason to get along for many reasons with Constantinople. Those were probably the factors that really solidified that everybody was going to go their separate way.
Yeah, that it was first weakening of the central government, and then different cultural differences, then linguistical differences, and then comes to the theological differences. Just was, that was the last straw that broke the camel back, so to speak. I really love doing this collaboration with you, Steve, and we want to open it up to our listeners, actually. If you guys want us to collaborate on another topic, feel free to reach out to Steve or reach out to me, and we will collaborate on it. I feel it's always, the conversation is always worth having to see where the different perspectives and these issues in. And I feel like hearing two voices on it is certainly better than one.
Yeah, there's plenty of opportunities for collaboration, even digging a little bit earlier than where we started off with in the 300s with our previous collaboration. There's a lot of areas of overlap.
Well, thank you for listening. Thank you, Steve, for collaborating with me. Hopefully, that would not be our last collaboration.
Definitely. Thank you so much for collaborating. It was great, and I definitely hope for many more.